Hello, I'm Deb, and I'm standing in the lobby of Western Spirit, Scottsdale's Museum of the West. This is a wonderful museum, a Smithsonian affiliate in downtown Scottsdale, Arizona, that's devoted to the past, present, and future of the Western United States. We're not specifically focused on Native American stories and artifacts and art, but I'm going to create a custom tour that really focuses on what we have in our collection that would be particularly interesting on the subject of Native American issues and stories and art. Okay, let's go. I'm going to start in our exhibit called John Clymer, People, Places, Predicaments. John Clymer, these paintings are from a collection of a man named Eddie Basha, who was a art collector and philanthropist here in Arizona. He collected the work of Western artists, and John Clymer was one of his favorites. John Clymer is part of the Cowboy Artists of America group. And his mission really was to tell the story of America during the expansion years in the early 1800s, long before the West had the OK Corral and cattle drives and Wild West gunfights. John Clymer wanted us to see what things were like starting in around 1800. And in that time, America was a fraction the size that it is now. America stopped at the Mississippi River. Where we are standing in Arizona now was a foreign country. So it was only after 1803, when we acquired the Louisiana Purchase, that the West was open for exploration and eventually expansion. So among the very first people who were out in the West were the fur trappers and traders. And this is one particular group of those. This painting is called the Métis Brigade. And the Métis were an indigenous group that came from the early French-Canadian fur trappers who were in Canada and the Northern Plains, and who married with Native American women. So their children were called Métis, which means half-blood, but they became a distinct indigenous group of their own. The Métis were great trappers and traders. They were great buffalo hunters. They would come down into the Northern Plains area of the United States to do buffalo hunting, and you can see that what John Clymer has put in the painting is called a Red River cart. These were used to transport the buffalo meat, the hides. The Métis were famous for making pemmican, and all of these things they traded to get goods that they wanted. That was the typical relationship in the early 1800s, that the Native American tribes had a mutually beneficial trade agreement with the American European trappers or trading companies. So let's move on and see something else from that era. Now this is a wonderful painting where John Clymer is showing some of the drama, some of the dangers that these early trappers faced. Mind you, the Native American tribes tried to help them, and in this case, the Native American tribes warned them that there was a bear out there, a grizzly, that was extremely dangerous. The trappers, the people from the east said, we know bears, we've got black bears and brown bears, we know how to handle bears. But the first time they saw a grizzly bear, they realized the true danger. That's why this painting is called Hasty Retreat, because guess who is hastening to retreat? You can see that there's a group of 4 traders here. They have canoes and they're trying to escape from the grizzly bear. Well, guess what? A grizzly bear could be 7 feet tall, standing high. He could weigh 800 pounds, and they could move at 35 miles an hour. So what's the ammunition? What's the weaponry that they have against these grizzlies? Well, this trapper in the painting is firing the only rifle of the time. That's a single-shot musket. Okay, single-shot muskets mean that after each shot they had to stop and reload, which took at least 35 or 40 seconds. So what do you do when this guy is coming at you at 35 miles an hour and it's going to take you 40 seconds to reload? Well, you better hope you've got some companions like this guy helping you to escape. And the grizzlies were very hard to bring down. The first bullet, the first musket ball, it was said, only made a matter. And when the trappers finally killed their first grizzly and opened it up, there were 8 musket balls inside this bear. That's how many it took to bring this animal down. So that was one of the really big dangers of trapping and trading in the West in the early 1800s. Now, in 1805, a military expedition was sent out by Thomas Jefferson to explore the new Western Territory. He directed them to try to find an all-water route to the Pacific, to establish friendly relationships with the native tribes along the way, and to investigate the flora, the fauna, the topography. So that was what the Lewis and Clark expedition set out to do. But again, they were faced with extreme hardship and danger. In this painting, which John Clymer calls Lewis and Clark in the Bitterroots, we see exactly what it was like, what kind of conditions they were facing. This is the Lewis and Clark expedition. And luckily, they were aided by many native tribes along the way that really essentially saved their lives many times. The first of these was the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. They overwintered there in 1804 at really North Dakota at the top of the Missouri River. And there they met someone that you see for the first time in this painting. This is Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a Shoshone who had been taken from her tribe by the Hidatsa when she was 12 years old, and she ended up in that Mandan camp, married to a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. Well, she was 16 when the expedition began, and she had just had her first child. First child was about 3 months old at the time. And she took that child all the way to the West Coast, overwintered and back again through all these conditions. You may be able to see that she is covered with like a Hudson's Bay blanket. Underneath that blanket on her back is her infant. And this is traversing the Bitterroot Mountains, which is the first mountain range that the expedition encountered. It was terrifying. It was twice as high as the mountains they were familiar with back east. It was virtually untracked. It was snowing, there was relatively little game to shoot, so hunger was a serious issue for the expedition. But it was the Shoshone who helped them in this case, because the Shoshone traded with them for horses and guides to show them the way across the Bitterroots. So as difficult as this was, it would have been far more difficult without the help of the Shoshone. So the Lewis and Clark expedition eventually made its way to the mouth of the Columbia River, to the Pacific Ocean. They proved that it wasn't possible to go all the way from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean only on water. But when they got to the Pacific Ocean, they were low on food, they were cold, they needed a place to overwinter because they landed there in late November. Well, they found help again from a Native American tribe, from the Clatsop tribe. You can see in the painting, he's depicted some of the native population, and they look very different from the Native Americans we're used to seeing in the plain settings. You might be able to see the hats that they wear are conical, made from woven cedar, because they kept the rain off. It was a rainforest basically. So in those wet, rainy conditions, those hats shed the water and kept them drier. They also showed them to the ocean where, what is going on in this painting? It's called the salt makers. Now, salt was very important to the expedition because in order to preserve game, meat, they had to have salt. As we've seen, they didn't have food sources everywhere along the way. So it was really important that when they could shoot game, they could preserve it and take them with it to eat along the way. So they devised this system. They built a fireplace cairn, and using buckets of seawater, they boiled the seawater down until only salt was left in the bottom of the bucket. Then they filled these little wooden barrels with the salt, and so they could take it with them on their pack trains. Now, they used 1,400 gallons of seawater to make 28 gallons of salt. So it was quite a labor-intensive experience, but it was vital because it allowed them to have game all along the way. So this painting, which John Clymer called The Peace Pipe, Overland Historians, depicts another meeting of a Native American tribe and white men. But it had the potential to have much more conflict than typical. The tribe is the Sioux, and the Sioux controlled much of the trade in the Missouri River region. They were actually threatened by the presence of this expedition because they thought that the Americans might be attempting to take away control of trade from them. This expedition is called the Astorian Expedition. It was sent out by John Jacob Astor, who realized that there was so much money to be made in the fur trade that he wanted to corner the international fur market. His expeditions weren't nearly as successful as Lewis and Clark. They became almost a fiasco along the way, primarily because they didn't have the incredible leadership, the military leadership that Lewis and Clark provided to their expedition. But in this situation, there was a good outcome because the Astorians said that they wanted to come in peace. They smoked the peace pipe with the native tribe, which was the tradition that showed you came in peace, not with hostilities in mind. And the two groups resolved their situation, and the Astorian expedition was able to move on peacefully. Now, this painting is sort of a full circle moment. Clymer called it Down the South Platte, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Well, guess who he is? He was the little baby that was on Sacagawea's back in the picture we saw a few moments ago. He had been partly raised by William Clark. Sacagawea asked William Clark to educate their son. So when he was probably 7-ish years old, he went to St. Louis, lived with William Clark and his family, eventually was even sent to Europe to be educated. So he was widely traveled and well educated, but he chose as an adult to come back to the land where he was from. This shows that he became a guide and a scout in the West. This is the South Platte River area. So he did have a good life, and he returned to his roots eventually. Now we're going to fast forward to 1877, a time that was very tragic for Native American tribes. This painting is called Nez Perce Crossing the Yellowstone, and it depicts a time when the increasing settlement, westward expansion, had pushed the native tribes off their own lands and created conflict commensurate with that expansion. In this situation, the Nez Perce tribe, which lived in western Idaho, eastern Washington state, the settlers wanted their good land, and eventually the military insisted that the Nez Perce tribe go onto a reservation. Some of the tribe did, but this particular band, which was led by Chief Joseph, did not want to give up their style of living and their land. So instead of going on the reservation, they ran. This painting shows what happened in 1877. There were 700 men, women, and children, that entire band. All of their horses, their livestock, the women and children carrying their teepees along the way. They left Idaho and they went on a march. They went from Idaho through Montana down into the Yellowstone Park area where they thought they could escape the military that was pursuing them this whole way, back up into Montana with skirmishes along the way with the military, and they made it to about 40 miles from the Canadian border before there was the ultimate skirmish, and at that point there was some starvation and illness, and they couldn't go on further. They had to surrender. It was then that you may have heard this quote. Chief Joseph said to the general he surrendered to, "My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun stands now, we will fight no more forever." Became a very well-known quote. And Chief Joseph continued to be a leader to his people, which was a good thing, because the reason they had surrendered is because the general had agreed to let them go back to their lands, which was all they wanted in the first place. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. They were sent to Oklahoma Territory, the Indian Territory. Chief Joseph continued to negotiate, to fight for a return to their lands. It took 3 or 4 years, but they were eventually granted the permission, and the band went back to the Idaho, Washington area. They were given a much smaller amount of land, but at least they were back in something more approaching their traditional lands and lifestyle. Okay, another thing John Clymer wanted to do was show the world how Native American tribes lived pre-contact. That means before the Europeans or Americans began their expansion into the West. He wanted to show how they lived. He wanted to show the differences between the tribes, because he well knew that Native Americans weren't just one thing. There was a wide variety of different lifestyles, conditions, and so forth. In this painting, which is called Moccasin Trail, he has set it amongst the Nez Perce tribe. You can see that the background, the environment looks very much like the Pacific Northwest. Tall trees, evergreens, lush vegetation. And what is happening in this painting is that the women and children, the women and girls, are out collecting berries. Berries were a very important part of the diet because they brought vitamin C to add to the very high protein diet that was typical. You might be able to see that they're using dogs here to carry what they're collecting. These are like panniers on the sides of the dogs. Dogs were very much a working friend of the tribe, and it's not a coincidence. The women here are doing all the work because they really did most of the work in providing food, gathering food for the family. Now we're just going to scoot down to a very different scene. This is a painting called The Providers. Here he is showing us the Northern Plains tribes. In the wintertime, they would find a protected ravine or valley to protect them somewhat from the harsh winds and the weather. And their survival depended on having enough provisions set aside to last the winter. You can see that he's shown the village dogs, which might be used in hunting. Here are the braves, the men who have shot an animal, looks like a deer, and they're bringing it back to be butchered and the hide treated. So that's his depiction of that tribe. Now we're going to go to a very different setting. This is called Sheep Eaters. And this tribe is in the Yellowstone area. Now, while many of the tribes cooperated and traded with each other, there were tribes that tended to be more hostile. One of those was the Blackfoot tribe, who were also in the Yellowstone area, Wyoming, Montana, Yellowstone area. The Blackfeet thought the Shoshone would interfere with their hunting grounds. So they pushed the Shoshone up onto the slopes of the mountains in the Yellowstone area. But what do we see here? The Shoshone kind of made the best with what they've got. You can see that what they've hunted is bighorn sheep, mountain sheep. They use those for food. They use the hides for clothing and protection. And you can see here, they're collecting the horns. Why are they collecting the horns? Well, the Shoshone also found a way to make a superior bow from the horns of the bighorn sheep. So that bow became a trade item that was much desired by other native tribes. So they gave themselves something to trade for other things that they needed. We're back to the Nez Perce tribe again. The Nez Perce were particularly known as horse breeders. Many of the tribes, in the plains especially, didn't breed horses. They tended to steal them to increase their herds. But the Nez Perce became breeders. And one of the breeds that they were known for was the Appaloosa. The spotted horses called the Appaloosas were associated with the Nez Perce. They were master horsemen. You can see that John Clymer has shown that's the Native American saddle, the kind of saddle they would have used when they weren't bareback. And he's shown their village in a historically accurate way. John Clymer was very concerned with having perfect historical accuracy. In fact, his wife was a historian, so when he contemplated any painting, they would actually go to that site so they could see and feel what the environment was like and make the painting feel that much more real to the viewer. And speaking of horses, this is a favorite painting of mine. It's called Breaking Wild Horses. And I think John Clymer is showing a really incredible hack. We've seen bronco busting, breaking wild horses, in a corral or out in the pastures or deserts, right? But in this case, this tribe is breaking the wild horses in the water, in a river. Now, why would they do that? You know, when you think about it, if the horse has to fight against the water, as you can see, his forelegs are kind of fighting out against the weight of the water, it tires the horse out. So it makes it easier and faster to break it. Also, I think a more compelling reason, if you're going to fall off, get bucked off this wild bronco bucking horse, would you rather land on the hard ground or in the water? I know I'd rather land in the water any day. Clymer's genius too, he loves to put expressions on his subjects. The expression on the rider's face is like, holy cow, hold on to your hat, while one of his colleagues seems to be gloating over the fact that he's having a hard time. Now, this painting brings up the importance of horses to the Native American tribes. The horses were only brought to North America by the Spanish when they came in the 1500s. And the Spanish did not want the Native Americans to have full access to the horses. They would use Native Americans to care for horses, but they did not want them to own horses and to have their own herds. And why was that? Well, it might make the natives more dangerous in battle, more mobile, more of a threat to the Spaniards. But in 1680, the Pueblo revolt occurred in mainly New Mexico, which was when the native Pueblo people revolted against the Spanish, who were trying to control them and convert them to Christianity. A result of that was that the horse herds of the Spanish, many of them got loose. Some of them became wild and started breeding and growing wild herds. And the Native Americans quickly quickly took advantage of those horses. Now, it changed their lifestyle almost completely because now they had far more mobility. So, for example, you could go across the plains to hunt for buffalo because it was so much easier to travel. You could travel further and faster. Horses were also used as beasts of burden, so they could put their packs, their travois, the teepees when they moved camps could be drawn with horses. It made the native tribes much more dangerous in battle because now they've got speed. Many of the tribes became expert riders. The Comanches were known for that, some of the Northern Plains tribes. So the horse really changed the Native American way of life. And this painting, called Hunt at Crow Heart, also shows an animal that was absolutely critical to all the native tribes. That, of course, is the buffalo. So at one time on this continent, there were 30 million buffalo, it's estimated. And by around 1880, there were only 600-ish left. And most of those, almost all of those, were up in the mountains in the Yellowstone region, simply because they were too remote for anyone to bother killing them. So the demise of the buffalo was almost the demise of Native Americans because they relied on the buffalo as their primary food source. They used buffalo for clothing, for shelter, for weapons, for tools, and it had a very important sacred meaning to the Native American tribes. That was one reason that the tribes eventually had to go onto reservations, because they had no food source left. They had to now rely on what the government was willing to give them, which didn't always go so well. In this painting, John Clymer's showing us how the Native Americans used horses to hunt buffalo. You can see that it's still a dicey business. We've got someone upside down and the horse on the ground. So hunting buffalo was still not easy or guaranteed success. But it was a vast improvement using horses to hunt buffalo, because before then they had to literally chase them on foot or chase them over a cliff in a situation you may have heard of called a buffalo jump, where the buffalo literally stampeded off a cliff and died hitting the ground, and there was therefore a lot of buffalo meat to be had. One final John Clymer painting I'd like you to see is this one, which is called Sacagawea at the Big Water. So we're revisiting Sacagawea, and this captures the moment when they had reached the Pacific. That was in the winter of 1805. And of course, the objective of the entire journey was to reach the ocean. Sacagawea had never seen the ocean, and initially the expedition did not give her permission to go see the ocean. But what happened at one point was that you might be able to see that John Clymer has shown a whale rib cage sticking out on the beach. The Clatsop Indians had told the expedition that there was a beach whale on the shore. Everyone was going to go down to see it, either to see if there was any food to be had or just for the spectacle of it. And Sacagawea managed to convince them this time, I am going to the big water. So this is John Clymer's depiction of her joy and awe at seeing the endless waves and water. There's a poetic justice here that she was able to enjoy and appreciate the big water. Okay, we're going to do something pretty different right now, because I want to show you the work of a sculptor, a bronze sculptor named John Coleman. John Coleman is a contemporary. He became a sculptor probably about the age of 40, but his particular interest is in Native American subjects. And he's fanatical about portraying not just historical accuracy, But his philosophy is that sculpture takes an idea and gives it three-dimensional form. So he wants his sculptures to speak to the spirit, not just the letter of the subject. This is a sculpture that represents three of the great Lakota or Sioux warriors. This is Chief Gall, Sitting Bull in the middle, Crazy Horse with the rifle on the end. Now you might remember that these three were the Lakota warriors who were instrumental in the Battle of Little Bighorn, otherwise known as Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Greasy Grass is the name that the Native Americans usually give to it. In that battle, Sitting Bull did not literally lead the fighting. He was at that point more of a medicine man and a seer, and it was his vision that an incredible victory was going to be had that set the Sioux on the path to that battle, which obviously was a victory for the Sioux and Cheyenne. But you can see the historical accuracy. He's depicted the kerchiefs, the hair, the tomahawk. Sitting Bull has a peace pipe, and Crazy Horse on the end has a rifle, a repeating rifle. It's a wonderful sculpture, and it's one of his ways of honoring what he considered to be heroic people. John Coleman also did a series of sculptures based on drawings that had been made by two artists, George Catlin and Carl Bodmer, who were the first artists to go out west with expeditions in the early 1830s. These were really the first people, these artists were the first people who showed the rest of the world what the Native American tribes looked like, what their habitat was, because all of the exploration to date had been done obviously without photographs to explain how things looked, or in fact without any artistry. So Catlin and Bodmer created a wonderful series of very detailed drawings and paintings, and John Coleman took those two-dimensional images and turned them into three-dimensional representations. In this case, for example, this is White Buffalo. White Buffalo was a medicine man for the Blackfeet Nation, and Coleman has shown all the details of his medicine drum, his lance, his headdress. The detail is truly incredible. And beside him, we have a Native American called Little Spaniard. He was a Comanche. And again, we have all of the details of a warrior in bronze. So we are now in an exhibit called Courage and Crossroads, a visual journey through the American West that represents paintings and artifacts from a collection by Tim Peterson. He had a particular interest in the 1800s, the Lewis and Clark expedition, native tribes during that time, and artists painting in the 1800s. So here we're looking at a reproduction of the map that was drawn, that was created by William Clark along the course of their journey. They traveled along the Missouri River all the way to North Dakota. They came to the headwaters of the Missouri, then had to get off their horses, off the river, try to find horses to go over the mountains, then connected again with a portion of the Snake River to the Columbia River, and eventually to the ocean. It was a journey that took 2 years and 4 months. Total round trip, they went 7,689 miles, and all of that was either in a canoe, on foot, or just a little bit on horseback. It was really an incredible feat. So these are some of the really important artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition. On the right is the actual peace pipe, so they call them peace pipe tomahawks, that Lewis and Clark took with them. And it was important for their relationships with the Native American tribes, because the peace pipe was a way of signaling that they came in peace. And when they first encountered each new tribe, the first gesture would be, shall we smoke first? They would each share the pipe around, and then they would begin to talk, to negotiate, to share thoughts, ideas, whatever. It was extremely important to the success of the expedition. The expedition did encounter about 50 tribes along the course of the journey. Most of the relationships were positive. The only actual conflict that resulted in violence was on the return journey, where two Blackfeet youths were thought to be stealing from them, and they ended up being shot by one of the members of the expedition. But that was the only actual violence that arose. Now, the painting you're looking at is by Charlie Russell, C.R. Russell, who was probably thought of as the original cowboy artist. What he's depicting there is the meeting between Lewis and Clark and the Shoshone. So he's showing the greeting, which was really an incredible opportunity that could have gone badly, but the encounter was saved by Sacagawea, because Sacagawea, it was discovered, had come from this very same Shoshone tribe before she was abducted at the age of 12, and the current chief of that tribe was none other than her brother. So there was a very, very warm kind of greeting between Shoshone and her brother. And so, of course, the brother and his tribe were well disposed to help the expedition by trading for horses and a guide to help them get over the Bitterroot Mountains. Now, there were some tribes who were suspicious of the newcomers, and in this painting by Gerard Curtis Delano, it's called Sioux Indians Watching the Lewis and Clark Expedition. The Sioux, as I think I said earlier, were in control of the trade along the Missouri River area, and when they saw this expedition of white men coming up the Missouri River, they were probably justified in their concern that this would be a threat to their position. Now we have a number of really important native artifacts in the Peterson collection. And this one is a deerskin battle dress that is believed to date to around 1820. You can see that it's not just a utilitarian garment. It's beautifully beaded with porcupine quills up near the top of the neck. There are pictograph drawings that probably show the owner in battle. It was typical to depict your victories in battle, and he did this on his clothing, which raises a really interesting point, and that's that in most native languages there is no word for, quote, art, in the sense that we think of art, which is something that's set aside to be specifically to admire, to inspire inspiration or meditation or thoughts. For the native tribes, it was believed that anything, no matter how utilitarian, could be beautiful. So whether it was a dress or a pot or a suitcase or the robe that you slept under, it could still be beautiful. And here's an example. This is a buffalo robe. The skins of the buffaloes were very important for shelter, for clothing. This one had been decorated with paints. Natural pigments were used. They could make brushes out of yucca leaves. You'll notice these are all geometric designs. The women of the tribes did not paint pictures representing people. They painted only geometric designs. This one is called a box and border motif, but it's still a beautiful thing. Now this incredible robe is believed to be made by a Crow warrior around 1850. You can see that this one is covered with pictures, and interestingly, they did not write top to bottom, left to right like we do. The pictograph stories start in the bottom right and go up towards the top left. And these robes were a way for a warrior to show his success in battle, his prowess as a warrior and his importance to the tribe. Now, you may notice, let me see if I can close in here, that many of the figures are painted blue, and there's a significance to that. The author, the person painting these pictures, painted himself in blue. So anywhere you see a blue figure, that's him. And each one of these little pictographs is showing, here's me vanquishing an enemy with a lance. Here's me killing 2 enemies with a lance. It's really a story of his success in battle. Now, the blue figures also they're all wearing a breech clout, which it has vertical stripes. That's associated with the Crow tribe. And across the middle, you may see that band of horses. Well, we've said that horses were an important way to show your wealth. The more horses you had, the more, quote, wealthy you were considered to be. One of those horses is painted blue, which I think must mean that that was his horse or his favorite horse. It's a beautiful piece, though, that's very well preserved. Now here are some more examples of everyday items that were beautiful. These are called parfleche, which really we think of as the Native American suitcases. They were actually a genius way to quickly and easily transport things in a closed container. They're made from rawhide. In this case, the one in the bottom is beaded. There is beautiful beadwork made from trade beads. The one beside it is painted with natural pigments. But these were essentially a flat piece of rawhide that could be folded up like an envelope to make a tight and probably waterproof package to transport whatever needed to be moved. And if you're a semi-nomadic people, it's very convenient to be able to have all your things move so easily. Now, I want you to see this one bag at the bottom, because that shows the importance of what we've called the trade goods. So part of that mutually beneficial trade relationship between fur traders and native people included what they called trade beads. So this is made up of tiny glass beads, seed beads, which they were made in Italy. In Venice, the island of Murano, right off of Venice, is where the glass beads at the time were made. So somehow these Venetian glass beads were bought by someone who brought them to probably the east coast of the US. They were then purchased by a trader who brought them on his journey, and he traded them with natives they probably wanted pelts so that they could take them back and sell them. So it's kind of the whole story of the trade goods that were important to both the traders and the Native Americans. This is an interesting artifact for us here in Arizona because it's a dress of an Apache woman whose territory included Arizona. There's trade goods on here. We can see the little red bits of cloth were called trade cloth. We have a little bit of beadwork, but we have a lot of these little metal cones, which were made from the lids, the tin lids of tobacco cans. They made them into those little tin cylinders, and they attached them to dresses or to moccasins, because when you moved, they would rattle against each other and make a noise that was considered desirable. The other thing I like about this dress is that you can see the long fringing. There was a utilitarian use for the fringing, not just to look cool. What was that? Well, when it rained, the rain would run down the fringe and off onto the ground instead of soaking into the fabric. So it was considered a way to keep you drier in bad weather. Pretty genius. And one more thing to wrap up is a kind of native art called ledger art. For the Plains Indians, you saw the buffalo robe where they documented their life and their battles. Well, once the tribes had to go onto reservations, they no longer had the buffalo to hunt or the hides to use to tell their stories. What they had access to was the paper, i.e. ledger paper, that the people, the military people or the Indian agents had at their disposal. So they traded for this ledger paper, which close up you can see that it's like a lined ledger paper, and colored pencils. That's what they had access to. So now they use these materials to tell their stories. You can see that, again, we have battle scenes. We're wearing a war bonnet. We're carrying weapons. So once again, they're telling their story in pictures. So I think I'll end on a note, a positive note, looking at a painting by C.R. Russell, Charlie Russell, the original cowboy artist. He was called that because he was an artist in the West. This one was painted in 1919. He was an artist in the West who actually lived the life of a cowboy. He also had a deep association with native tribes. He lived with, I think it was the Blackfeet for 6 months, 8 months. So he had a real knowledge of their lifestyle, and he was a lover of history. He wanted the world to see how the West was when it was still the Old West. This painting is called Fighting Meat, AKA Horse and the Hunter, and he's showing a scene of how a native tribe would have shot buffalo, would have killed buffalo. You can see in the back there's the dust of a stampede. So probably the natives would create a stampede and in the confusion cut out some of the slower or weaker animals that they could then, this Native American is hunting with a bow and arrow. You can see that he's horseback, both hands are on the bow and arrow. He is preparing to shoot the buffalo. It's a beautiful painting. This was painted over 100 years ago, and the colors are still beautifully vibrant. And it tells a story that is part of our history, an important part of our history, and something that thanks to Charlie Russell, we can see here live on the wall and continue to appreciate it. Okay, thank you so much for your time.